Hey guys, tonight we're going to step into the frozen farmlands of ancient China and discover why peasant families faced winters so brutal that they make modern hardships seem like minor inconveniences. We're talking about a civilization where winter wasn't just cold weather, it was a systematic test of human endurance that claimed millions of lives and shaped the character of an entire people. Picture this. You're a peasant farmer during the Han Dynasty, around 100 BCE, watching the first snow fall on your small village in Henan province. While the emperor sits warm in his palace surrounded by stored grain and burning braziers, you're calculating whether your family has enough rice to survive until spring, knowing that government tax collectors already took 60% of your harvest, that one blizzard could cut you off from help for months, and that your thin cotton clothes provide almost no protection against the Siberian winds heading your way. The mathematics of survival are brutal in their simplicity. Your family of 6 needs approximately 1 dan of grain per person per month to survive. That's 6 dan monthly, 30 dan for a 5-month winter. But you only have 19 dan left after taxes, corvée obligations, and the grain you're forced to save for next year's planting. The numbers don't add up, and they never have for Chinese peasants. Winter survival requires more than arithmetic. It demands innovation, social cunning, and often impossible choices about who lives and who dies. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world, especially those of you experiencing your own winter seasons right now. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together, straight into the snow-covered villages of ancient China, where winter survival required a combination of agricultural knowledge, political cunning, and sheer determination that few civilizations have ever demanded from their common people. You're about to experience what it was like to face months of darkness, knowing that your survival depended not just on the food you'd managed to store, but on navigating a complex web of social obligations, imperial taxation, and natural disasters that could destroy everything your family had built over generations. This isn't just a story about cold weather. It's about how geography, politics, and human nature combined to create survival challenges that tested the limits of what people could endure. Tonight you're not just learning about ancient China's harsh winters, you're living through them, feeling the bite of wind that cuts through inadequate clothing, tasting the watery gruel that had to last for weeks, and understanding why Chinese peasants developed a resilience that became legendary throughout the ancient world. Let's step into that world together, where winter was the ultimate test of everything that made you human. You wake in your earthen-walled farmhouse in the Yellow River Valley as the first winter storm of the season begins to build overhead. The air carries that particular stillness that every Chinese peasant learns to recognize. The calm before a weather system that can bury entire villages under snow for weeks at a time. Your breath forms clouds in the freezing air inside your house, and you know that the real cold hasn't even arrived yet. Your location puts you at the mercy of some of the most extreme weather patterns on Earth. The Yellow River region sits at roughly the same latitude as the Mediterranean, but there's no warm sea here to moderate temperatures. Instead, you face the full fury of Siberian air masses that sweep down from the northern steppes, carrying cold that can freeze exposed skin in minutes, and winds that cut through your thin cotton robes like knives through paper. The geography surrounding your village creates a perfect storm of winter misery that seems almost designed by malevolent gods to test human endurance. To the north, the vast expanse of the Mongolian plateau offers no barrier against Arctic winds. These air masses gather strength as they cross thousands of miles of frozen grassland, arriving at your village with temperatures that can drop to 40 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. The wind doesn't just bring cold, it brings the kind of penetrating chill that seeps into your bones and stays there for months. To the south, the towering Qinling Mountains create an impenetrable barrier that blocks warm, moist air from reaching your region during the winter months. These peaks, some rising over 12,000 feet, act like a massive wall that traps cold air in the northern plains while preventing the southern monsoons from bringing relief. The result is a climate that's both desperately cold and bone dry, with humidity levels so low that your lips crack and bleed. Your skin becomes like parchment, and every breath feels like inhaling shards of ice. You step outside to check your firewood supply and immediately feel the bite of wind that signals a major storm approaching. The temperature has dropped 20 degrees since yesterday, and the air carries that metallic smell that precedes heavy snow. This isn't the gentle snow of poetry and paintings. This is the kind of weather that kills. The wind carries ice crystals that sting your face like thousands of tiny needles, and makes breathing so painful that you have to cover your mouth and nose with cloth just to survive outdoors. Within hours, this storm will pile snow against your door until you have to dig your way out, assuming you survive the night without your poorly insulated house collapsing under the weight. The snow here doesn't fall gently. It arrives in horizontal sheets driven by winds that can reach 60 miles per hour, creating whiteout conditions so complete that you can't see your own hand extended in front of your face. The Yellow River itself, which gives life to your region during summer months, becomes an instrument of winter torture. During the coldest periods, the river freezes solid, creating a highway for Arctic air that funnels directly through your valley. The ice forms so thick that you could drive ox carts across it, but that same ice represents the death of the water transport that brings food and fuel to isolated villages during milder weather. When spring arrives and the ice begins to break up, the river becomes even more dangerous. Ice dams form and then burst without warning, sending torrents of freezing water and massive ice blocks downstream. These spring floods can destroy bridges, wash away entire villages, and kill anyone unfortunate enough to be caught in their path. The very river that provides the irrigation for your crops becomes a destroyer that can wipe out years of careful work in a matter of hours. The soil beneath your feet tells its own story of winter suffering. The lias deposits that make this region agriculturally productive during good years become treacherous during winter storms. This fine, powdery soil can be picked up by winter winds and turned into dust storms so severe that day becomes night and breathing becomes impossible without protection. These dust storms can bury crops, fill wells with sediment, and strip the protective topsoil from fields that took generations to develop. The timing of these weather systems creates a cruel irony that dominates peasant life throughout northern China. The harsh winter weather typically breaks just in time for spring planting, but the growing season is compressed into such a narrow window that any delay can mean disaster. Late spring storms can destroy newly planted crops, while early autumn frosts can prevent grain from ripening properly. You have perhaps 180 frost-free days to accomplish all the agricultural work that will determine whether your family survives the following winter. Your farmhouse, like every peasant dwelling in the region, represents centuries of adaptation to these brutal conditions, but the adaptations are never quite adequate. The walls are thick earth mixed with straw and animal dung, designed to provide insulation against the cold. The roof is heavy tile that won't be torn off by winter winds, but it also makes the house prone to collapse under heavy snow loads. The windows are covered with paper rather than glass, providing minimal protection against wind and cold, but allowing some light to penetrate during the short winter days. The heating system in your house consists of a single small brazier that burns wood or dried grass, supplemented by a kang, a raised sleeping platform with flues underneath that can be warmed by redirecting smoke from cooking fires. But fuel is so precious that you can only heat the house for a few hours each day, and even then, the temperature inside rarely rises above freezing during the worst winter weather. The geographical isolation that winter brings to your village represents another dimension of suffering that urban dwellers can barely imagine. When major storms hit, your village becomes completely cut off from the outside world for weeks or even months at a time. The roads become impassable, the rivers freeze or flood, and mountain passes disappear under snowdrifts that can be 30 feet deep. During these isolation periods, your village must survive entirely on whatever resources were stored before winter arrived. This isolation means that if your grain stores run out, if someone becomes seriously ill, or if your house burns down, there's no possibility of outside help until spring returns. Villages have been found in spring with every inhabitant dead from starvation or exposure, their bodies preserved by the cold until the snow melts enough for travellers to discover the tragedy. The psychological impact of this geographical imprisonment cannot be overstated. For 5 to 6 months each year, your entire world shrinks to the boundaries of your village, and often to just the interior of your house. The combination of extreme cold, minimal daylight, and complete isolation creates a form of sensory deprivation that can drive people to madness. Domestic violence increases during winter months, family members turn against each other under the stress of confinement, and suicide rates spike among those who cannot endure another season of suffering. The mountain ranges that surround your region create microclimates that can vary dramatically over short distances, but none of these variations provide relief from winter hardship. Valleys become frost pockets, where cold air settles and temperatures can be 20 degrees lower than the surrounding areas. Ridgelines are exposed to winds that make survival impossible without shelter. Even slight changes in elevation can mean the difference between marginally survivable conditions and certain death from exposure. The seasonal patterns that govern your region's climate follow rhythms that seem designed to maximize human suffering, while providing just enough relief to keep populations from abandoning the area entirely. Winters are long and brutal, lasting from October to April in bad years. Spring is brief and often interrupted by late storms that can destroy crops and kill livestock. Summer is hot and dry, with frequent droughts that stress crops just when they should be growing most rapidly. Autumn is the only truly favourable season, but it's so short that all harvesting, food preservation and winter preparation must be compressed into a few frantic weeks. The wind patterns that affect your region during winter months deserve special mention because they represent one of the most consistently destructive forces that peasant families must endure. The winter monsoon brings winds from the northwest that can maintain speeds of 30 to 40 miles per hour for days at a time. These winds don't just make outdoor work impossible, they strip heat from buildings so efficiently that even well-built houses become uninhabitable without constant heating. The dust and debris carried by these winds can blind animals, destroy stored food, and make breathing dangerous even indoors. The psychological impact of constant wind noise, a howling, shrieking sound that continues day and night for weeks, drives many people to desperation. Children become terrified to sleep, adults develop nervous conditions, and families huddle together in small interior rooms trying to escape both the physical and mental assault of unending wind. Water sources represent another geographical challenge that becomes acute during winter months. Wells freeze solid, requiring families to melt snow and ice for drinking water, a process that consumes precious fuel and provides water that's often contaminated with dust and debris. Rivers and streams become inaccessible under thick ice, and the springs that provide water during other seasons often freeze completely. The quality of water available during winter months affects every aspect of daily life. Contaminated water causes illness just when families are weakest from poor nutrition and cold stress. The fuel required to purify water by boiling competes with heating needs, and the time and energy required to collect and process water takes away from other survival activities. As you stand in your doorway watching the storm clouds gather, you understand that you're not just facing another winter. You're confronting geographical forces that have shaped Chinese civilization for thousands of years. The harshness of northern China's winter climate created a population that was incredibly resilient, resourceful, and disciplined. But it also created conditions where survival often required moral compromises that would be unthinkable in gentler climates. The landscape around you has been shaped by countless generations of peasant families who learned to work with and against these geographical realities. The terraced fields that climb every hillside represent centuries of labour to create productive land in a region where nature provides little. The complex irrigation systems that channel water from distant sources reflect sophisticated engineering born from desperate necessity. The village layout, with houses clustered together for mutual protection and support, demonstrates social adaptations to geographical challenges that threatened individual family survival. Tonight, as the first snowflakes begin to fall and the wind starts to howl through the gaps in your walls, You prepare for another battle against geographical forces that have tested human endurance for millennia. The cold that's coming will test every survival skill your family has developed, every social alliance you've built, and every resource you've managed to accumulate during the brief growing season that's now ending. The sound that strikes terror into every peasant heart during winter arrives 3 weeks after the first snow. The rhythmic beating of official drums announcing the approach of imperial tax collectors. You peer through the paper window of your farmhouse and watch the procession making its way down the village's snow-covered main path. Mounted officials wrapped in thick fur coats, armed guards on horseback, and behind them, the ox carts that will carry away grain your family desperately needs to survive until spring. You understand with bitter clarity that the timing of this visit is not accidental. The magistrate's agents always arrive during the worst weather, when peasant families are most vulnerable, when the roads are difficult enough that organised resistance becomes impossible, and when the prospect of fleeing to avoid taxation means certain death in the frozen wilderness. This is imperial administration at its most calculated, using winter itself as a weapon to ensure peasant compliance with governmental demands. Your father emerges from the storage room where he's been hiding what little grain remains after the autumn assessment, his face wearing the expression you've learned to recognise, the look of a man who must choose between feeding his family and defying imperial authority. In his hands, he carries wooden tally sticks that record this year's harvest yield, each notch representing grain that might mean the difference between life and death before spring planting becomes possible. The imperial taxation system operates according to principles that seem designed to extract maximum resources from peasant families, precisely when those resources are most crucial for survival. The land tax alone claims 30% of your annual harvest, but that's only the beginning of your family's obligations to the state. There's grain tribute for the emperor's armies, currently fighting campaigns against nomadic tribes along the northern frontier. There's the transportation tax to move tribute grain to imperial granaries hundreds of miles away. There's the corvée labour tax that can claim your father's work for months at a time, leaving your family without its primary breadwinner during crucial periods. But beyond these official assessments lie countless smaller levies that local officials impose to fund regional projects, line their own pockets, and demonstrate their loyalty to imperial authority. The Autumn Festival tax supports ceremonies honouring the emperor's ancestors. The road maintenance tax funds infrastructure projects that benefit merchants and officials, but rarely improve conditions for peasant families. The military preparation tax provides weapons and supplies for local garrisons that exist primarily to enforce tax collection and suppress peasant unrest. As the tax collectors approach your door, you feel the weight of what Confucian scholars call the mandate of heaven, the theoretical principle that grants the emperor divine authority to rule, in exchange for ensuring the welfare of all his subjects. But from your perspective, huddled in a freezing farmhouse while officials demand grain your family needs to survive, the mandate of heaven feels more like systematic abandonment by both earthly and celestial powers. The lead tax collector, a thin man whose silk robes seem absurdly luxurious against the backdrop of peasant poverty, dismounts from his horse and approaches your door with the casual arrogance of someone who has never wondered where his next meal will come from. His guards spread out behind him, their hands resting on sword hilts, a reminder that imperial taxation is ultimately backed by the threat of violence against families whose only crime is being born into the wrong social class. "Farmer Zhao," the collector announces, reading from a scroll that contains your family's detailed tax assessment. This household owes 18 dan of rice as land tax, 12 dan as military tribute, 6 dan for transportation costs, 4 dan for road maintenance, 3 dan for festival obligations, and 2 dan for administrative expenses. Total assessment, 45 dan of grain, to be delivered immediately for transport to the imperial granaries. Your father's face goes pale as he performs the mental calculation that determines your family's survival prospects. 45 dan represents more than 70% of your total harvest. Grain that was supposed to sustain 6 people through 5 months of winter when no other food sources are available. But challenging a tax assessment is worse than useless. It's an invitation to increased scrutiny, additional penalties, and possibly charges of sedition that could result in your family's exile to frontier regions where survival is virtually impossible. You watch your father perform the ritual of submission that every peasant must master to survive in imperial China. He kowtows before the tax collector, pressing his forehead to the frozen ground 3 times in acknowledgement of imperial authority, then rises to speak in the carefully modulated tones that convey respect without suggesting civility or wealth that might attract additional attention. This unworthy farmer accepts the wisdom of the imperial assessment, he says, using the formal language required for interactions with government officials. However, this humble household begs to inform the gracious representative of the Son of Heaven that severe weather conditions have affected grain storage capabilities this year. Perhaps the merciful agents of imperial authority might consider partial payment now, with the remainder to be delivered when weather conditions permit safe transport. It's a desperate gambit, an attempt to delay payment that might allow your family to stretch remaining grain stores through the worst part of winter. But the tax collector's response reveals the futility of appealing to official mercy during the season, when peasant families most need governmental understanding and assistance. The imperial treasury operates according to schedules that serve the entire empire, he replies, with the bureaucratic coldness that characterizes imperial administration. Local weather conditions do not alter the state's financial requirements. The grain tax was assessed based on harvest yields reported by village headmen, and our records indicate that this region produced excellent crops this year. Individual claims of hardship do not reduce obligations to support the emperor's government. Behind the collector's formal language lies the brutal reality of imperial resource extraction. The system requires constant revenue streams to support armies, officials, public works projects, and court expenses that take absolute precedence over peasant survival. Tax collection operates according to quotas that must be met regardless of local conditions, and individual hardship is considered irrelevant to larger state needs that officials never question or modify. The process of grain collection that follows reveals the sophisticated machinery of oppression that makes peasant resistance nearly impossible. The guards move through your family's storage areas with practiced efficiency, measuring grain with official instruments that ensure accurate accounting, recording exact quantities on documents that make future disputes virtually impossible to resolve in your favour, and sealing their records with official stamps that carry the full authority of imperial law. But the collectors don't just take grain, they take the best grain, leaving your family with broken kernels, immature rice, and debris that was swept from storage container bottoms. They claim the right to select which portions of your harvest meet imperial quality standards, and what remains for your family's survival is whatever the officials consider unfit for the emperor's granaries or army provisions. Your mother emerges from the house carrying a cloth bundle that represents another aspect of the survival calculations that govern peasant official interactions. The bundle contains eggs from your family's few chickens, preserved vegetables from your small garden, fermented rice wine that took months to prepare, and small copper coins that represent your family's entire monetary savings. These gifts might encourage the tax collectors to overlook some minor regulation or reduce their assessment by small amounts. But offering them also acknowledges that officials have power to grant or deny favours based on personal whim rather than consistent policy. The tax collector accepts the gifts with casual indifference, neither acknowledging your mother's gesture nor rejecting it, simply absorbing the offerings into the machinery of extraction that defines the relationship between imperial authority and peasant subjects. These gifts won't reduce your family's official tax burden, but they might prevent additional penalties or ensure that future assessments don't increase beyond what your household can possibly pay. As the grain collection process continues, you overhear conversations between guards that reveal additional layers of the system's institutional cruelty. They're discussing their route for the remainder of the day, calculating which villages they can reach before dark, speculating about which families might attempt to hide grain or resist payment, and planning strategies for dealing with households that lack adequate resources to meet their assessments. The village headman reported that the Chen family claimed partial crop failure this year, one guard mentions, but their fields produce similar yields to neighbouring plots, probably attempting to conceal grain stores in underground caches or false walls within their house. Standard investigation procedures then, another replies. Complete property search, confiscation of any hidden resources, double assessment next year for attempting to defraud the Imperial Treasury, and notation in their permanent record that marks them as politically unreliable. The conversation reminds you that the taxation system includes sophisticated mechanisms for detecting and punishing any attempt at resistance. Village headmen are required to report on their neighbours' activities, creating surveillance networks that make organised opposition virtually impossible. Tax collectors receive training in recognising signs of hidden wealth or concealed grain stores. The penalties for attempted tax evasion are severe enough to destroy entire extended families for generations. The corvée labour obligations that accompany grain taxation represent another dimension of imperial burden that becomes particularly crushing during winter months. Your father's assignment requires 45 days of unpaid work on road construction projects that will occur during the coldest part of winter, when his labour is most needed for family survival activities. He must provide his own tools, food, and transportation to work sites that may be miles from home, sleeping in temporary shelters that offer minimal protection against winter weather. The timing of corvée assignments reflects the same calculated cruelty that characterises winter tax collection. Imperial projects continue regardless of weather conditions, and peasant workers who complain about harsh conditions or request additional provisions face beatings, increased work assignments, or charges of sabotage that can result in exile or execution. The system treats peasant welfare as completely subordinate to state infrastructure needs and demonstrates imperial power by forcing rural families to choose between political compliance and family survival. As cart after cart of grain disappears down the village path, escorted by guards who show no awareness of the human consequences of their actions, you calculate the implications with the mathematical precision that keeps peasant families alive during crisis periods. The grain being taken represents approximately 4 months of adequate nutrition for your family. What remains must somehow stretch across 5 months of winter, during which time your household will have no income and minimal opportunities to supplement your diet through hunting, gathering, or trade. The mathematics become even more complex when you consider that not all remaining grain can be consumed immediately. Some must be preserved as seed grain for next year's planting. Without adequate seeds, there will be no harvest next autumn, and no hope of breaking the cycle of subsistence that defines peasant existence. Some grain must be held in reserve for emergencies, illness, unexpected obligations, or demands for additional taxes that officials might impose at any time during the winter months. Your mother's approach to managing these impossible calculations involves techniques for extracting maximum nutritional value from minimal food resources. But even her innovations cannot overcome the basic arithmetic of imperial extraction. The system takes so much grain that peasant families must choose between maintaining seed stocks for future planting and feeding hungry children in the present. Families that consume their seed grain to survive immediate starvation face years of rebuilding their agricultural capacity from inferior seeds purchased or borrowed from neighbours at unfavourable terms. The social control mechanisms that support imperial taxation create additional pressures that affect every aspect of peasant behaviour during winter months. Village headmen maintain detailed records of each family's compliance with state obligations, and these records influence future tax assessments, corvée assignments, and the treatment that family members receive from local authorities. Families that develop reputations for resistance or unreliability find themselves subjected to increased scrutiny and harsher treatment that can make survival impossible during crisis periods. But perhaps the most insidious aspect of the imperial taxation system is how it turns winter survival strategies into potential sources of vulnerability. Families that successfully preserve grain stores or develop effective survival techniques become targets for increased tax assessments, rather than models for other households to emulate. The more successfully your family manages winter challenges, the more likely you are to face demands for additional contributions to imperial needs. As the tax collection procession finally leaves your village, you help your father secure what remains of the family's grain stores. The containers that were reasonably full just hours ago now seem pathetically inadequate, holding barely enough grain to sustain your household through the darkest months of winter. But you also understand that your family's situation, while desperate, is actually better than many others. Some households will lose 80 or 90% of their harvest of various imperial levies and obligations. The weight of imperial authority settles over your family like the snow that continues to fall outside your windows. The system claims to protect peasant families while systematically ensuring their vulnerability, promises benevolent governance while extracting resources that families need for basic survival, and maintains social order through mechanisms that turn winter itself into an instrument of political control. Tonight, as your family gathers around a meal that consists of thin rice gruel mixed with vegetable scraps, the same meal you'll eat for the next several months, you feel the full weight of serving an imperial system that views peasant welfare as subordinate to state needs. The mandate of heaven may grant the emperor divine authority to rule, but for families facing winter with depleted grain stores, it feels more like a curse that condemns millions of people to choose between loyalty to distant authority and loyalty to their own children. The imperial burden that defines peasant existence in ancient China isn't just about taxation or forced labour. It's about a comprehensive system of extraction that uses winter hardship as a tool for ensuring political compliance. When survival itself depends on avoiding governmental attention, when success attracts punishment rather than reward, and when loyalty to the state requires betraying your family's basic needs, the very concept of benevolent governance becomes a cruel mockery of human dignity and suffering. 2 months into winter, you stand in what remains of your family's grain storage area, holding a handful of rice kernels and performing calculations that will determine whether your loved ones see another spring. The arithmetic is relentless in its brutality. 12 dan of grain remaining, 6 family members to feed, 3 months until planting can begin, and no possibility of obtaining additional food until the next harvest arrives in late autumn. Your grandfather, the keeper of agricultural wisdom accumulated over 6 decades of farming in northern China, sits nearby examining seed grain with the reverent attention of someone handling sacred objects. Each kernel he sets aside for next year's planting represents food your family cannot consume this winter, but without adequate seed stock, there will be no harvest next autumn, no hope of breaking the subsistence cycle that traps peasant families in perpetual vulnerability. "Look at these," he says, holding up a palmful of rice kernels that show the dark spots of fungal infection. The early frost, combined with excessive moisture during storage, we're losing more seed grain than usual to rot and pest damage. If this continues, we'll have to choose between eating our planting stock and having nothing to grow next year. You examine the infected kernels and immediately understand the implications. Fungal contamination doesn't just destroy individual grains, it spreads through stored grain like a plague, potentially wiping out entire family food reserves in a matter of weeks. The dark spots your grandfather has identified represent an enemy more dangerous than human armies, because they attack the foundation of agricultural survival itself. The farming techniques available to your family represent the accumulated knowledge of centuries, but they operate within constraints that make peasant agriculture perpetually vulnerable to forces beyond human control. Your 3 acres of cultivated land produce barely enough food to sustain your household during good years, and any disruption in the agricultural cycle can mean the difference between survival and starvation. The tools you use for farming, a wooden plough with iron cutting edge, hand sickles for harvesting, and various implements for soil preparation, represent technology that has remained essentially unchanged for generations. These tools are effective when used skillfully, but they require enormous human energy to operate and limit how much land a single family can cultivate during the brief growing season. Your plough, inherited from your father and repaired countless times over the years, can break ground and prepare seed beds, but it cannot work soil that's too wet, too dry, or frozen solid. During spring planting, you have perhaps 3 weeks when soil conditions are optimal for ploughing, and weather delays during this critical period can reduce yields by 30% or more. The timing of agricultural work requires precision that's often impossible to achieve when weather patterns are unpredictable. The soil itself tells a story of intensive cultivation that has gradually depleted the natural fertility that once made this region agriculturally productive. Generations of growing the same crops in the same fields, combined with limited access to fertilizers beyond human and animal waste, have created conditions where good harvests require increasingly perfect weather and management conditions. You can see this depletion in the pale colour of your soil, the way water runs off instead of soaking in, and the declining yields that force your family to work harder each year for smaller returns. The lowest deposits that originally made this region fertile have been eroded by wind and water, leaving behind earth that requires constant inputs of organic matter and careful management to produce adequate crops. The growing season in your region is compressed into a narrow window between the last spring frost and the first autumn freeze, perhaps 160 to 180 days if weather conditions are favourable. During this brief period, your family must accomplish all the planting, cultivating and harvesting that will determine survival for the entire year. The margin for error is so small that a single weather event can destroy months of careful work. You remember last spring's crisis, when flooding delayed planting by 3 weeks. Your father made the desperate decision to plant anyway, knowing that late planting typically reduces yields, but hoping that favourable weather during the growing season might compensate for the delayed start. The gamble succeeded partially. The harvest was adequate rather than abundant, but you learned how narrow the margins become when agricultural cycles operate within such tight constraints. The crop varieties you grow represent a compromise between productivity and reliability that demonstrates the impossible choices facing peasant agriculture. High-yielding rice varieties produce more grain per plant but are more susceptible to disease, pest damage, and weather stress. Hardy varieties that resist environmental challenges produce lower yields but offer greater security during difficult growing seasons. Your family plants primarily short-grain rice that matures quickly enough to avoid early frost damage, but this variety produces smaller harvests than the long-grain types that wealthy landowners can afford to risk. The seeds you save each year represent genetic resources accumulated over generations, adapted to local soil and climate conditions through careful selection and breeding practices that your ancestors developed. But maintaining genetic diversity in crop varieties requires resources that peasant families often cannot afford. During harsh winters, families face terrible choices between consuming seed grain to prevent immediate starvation and preserving planting stock for future agricultural production. You've seen families forced to eat their best seeds, then spend years trying to rebuild their crop genetics from inferior varieties purchased or borrowed from neighbours. The pest problems that plague Chinese agriculture create another layer of vulnerability that wealthy landowners can address, but peasant families must simply endure. Locusts, rice weevils, stem borers, and various fungal diseases can destroy crops in the field or grain stores after harvest, and individual families lack resources to implement effective pest control measures. Locust swarms represent the most dramatic agricultural catastrophe, arriving without warning and consuming everything green and growing in a matter of hours. You've heard stories of swarms so dense they block sunlight, stripping fields bare and leaving entire regions facing famine. Individual families have no defense against such attacks. Only large-scale coordination and resources can provide protection, and such coordination rarely extends to isolated peasant communities. The storage challenges that affect your family's grain reserves illustrate another dimension of agricultural vulnerability that becomes acute during winter months. Without access to properly constructed granaries, peasant families must store their harvest in containers that provide minimal protection against moisture, temperature fluctuations, and pest intrusion. Your family's grain storage consists of large ceramic jars and woven baskets that offer some protection against rodents and insects, but cannot maintain the consistent temperature and humidity levels that prevent spoilage during long-term storage. You spend hours each day during winter months inspecting stored grain, removing damaged kernels before contamination spreads, and rotating stock to ensure that older grain gets consumed before it deteriorates. This constant vigilance represents unpaid labour that wealthy households can delegate to servants, but peasant families must perform themselves while managing all the other tasks necessary for winter survival. The time and energy required for grain management competes with fuel gathering, house maintenance, textile production, and food preparation activities that are equally essential for family welfare. The water management systems that support agriculture in your region create dependencies that make entire communities vulnerable to disruptions they cannot control. Your fields depend on irrigation channels that carry water from mountain streams dozens of miles away, and these channels require constant maintenance through coordinated community labour. During winter months, when this maintenance becomes impossible, accumulated damage from floods, erosion, and deliberate destruction by upstream communities can render irrigation systems useless by spring planting time. You've participated in the exhausting communal labour required to rebuild these systems, digging out sediment, repairing damaged walls, negotiating water-sharing agreements with neighbouring villages, work that's essential for everyone's survival, but takes time and energy away from individual family agricultural efforts. The fertilisation methods available to peasant families represent another area where resource limitations create agricultural vulnerabilities that compound during winter months. Human and animal waste provides the primary source of nutrients for crop production, but collecting, processing, and applying these materials requires labour and resources that compete with other survival necessities. During winter, when families are burning every available organic material for fuel, the competition between fertiliser production and heating becomes acute. Materials that should be composted for next year's crops must be burned immediately to prevent family members from freezing to death. This creates a vicious cycle where winter survival strategies undermine agricultural productivity, which in turn makes future winter survival more difficult. Your family's few animals, 2 chickens, a pig, and occasionally a goat when resources permit, provide some fertiliser, but maintaining these animals through winter requires feed and shelter that compete with human needs. The chickens stop laying eggs when temperatures drop below freezing. The pig requires grain that your family desperately needs, and the goat must be fed stored hay that could serve as fuel or bedding material. The decision-making process that governs animal management during winter reveals the brutal calculations that define peasant agriculture. Each animal represents both an asset and a liability, potential food, fertiliser, and breeding stock, but also mouths to feed when grain is scarce and bodies to keep warm when fuel is precious. Families often face choices between slaughtering animals for immediate food and preserving breeding stock for future agricultural production. The agricultural calendar that governs your family's yearly cycle creates pressures that become especially acute during winter months, when planning for the next growing season must occur, while survival through the current crisis remains uncertain. Spring planting preparations begin in late winter, when snow still covers the ground and family resources are at their lowest point of the year. Field preparation requires breaking frozen ground, clearing irrigation channels of ice and debris, and repairing tools and equipment that deteriorated during winter storage. This work demands physical strength and energy when family members are weakest from months of inadequate nutrition, and it requires materials and resources when household supplies are nearly exhausted. The seed selection process that determines next year's agricultural productivity occurs during the most desperate part of winter, when every grain of rice represents potential survival calories that could keep family members alive for another day. Your grandfather's expertise in identifying the best seeds becomes crucial during these decisions. He can distinguish varieties that will produce reliable yields from those that might fail under stress, but his knowledge cannot overcome the basic arithmetic of hunger versus future production. These kernels from the southeast corner of the upper field, he explains, holding up rice grains that look identical to your untrained eye, always produce plants that resist lodging during heavy rains, but we only have 2 scoops of this variety left, and your sister needs to eat something today, or she won't have strength to help with household work. The agricultural knowledge that your family possesses represents generations of accumulated learning about local soil conditions, weather patterns, crop varieties, and farming techniques. But this knowledge becomes almost useless when the basic resources required for agriculture are consumed for immediate survival. You know which fields produce the best yields, which planting dates optimize harvest timing, and which cultivation methods maximize productivity. but knowledge cannot substitute for adequate seeds, tools, and labour when winter survival consumes everything your family has accumulated. The crop rotation practices that maintain soil fertility require planning across multiple years and the ability to take fields out of production temporarily to restore their productivity. But peasant families operating at subsistence levels cannot afford to reduce current production for long-term soil management. Every available acre must produce food every year, leading to soil exhaustion that reduces yields and increases vulnerability to crop failures. Your family's 3 acres must produce not only food for current consumption, but also seed grain for next year, grain for tax payments, material for trade and social obligations, and reserves for emergency situations. This means that soil depletion occurs constantly, and families must develop techniques for maintaining productivity on overworked land using minimal external inputs. The composting methods your family employs represent sophisticated recycling of organic materials, but winter conditions make proper composting almost impossible. The biological processes that break down organic matter into usable fertilizer slow dramatically in cold weather, and the materials that should be composted often must be burned for immediate heat. Spring planting occurs before winter compost has time to decompose properly, forcing families to use partially processed organic matter that may not provide adequate nutrition for growing crops. The agricultural tools that your family depends on require maintenance and replacement that becomes especially challenging during winter months when metalworking and woodworking activities are limited by cold weather and fuel shortages. Your plough blade must be sharpened or replaced before spring planting, but the blacksmith may lack fuel to maintain his forge, and your family may lack resources to pay for metalwork services. Tool maintenance during winter months requires planning and resource allocation that competes with immediate survival needs. Iron tools must be cleaned and oiled to prevent rust, wooden handles need repair or replacement, and cutting edges require sharpening using stones and techniques that demand time and materials when both are precious. Families that cannot maintain their tools properly face spring planting with inadequate equipment that reduces productivity and increases labour requirements. The agricultural labour requirements that determine your family's farming capacity change dramatically between seasons, but winter planning must account for spring and summer work needs when family members may be weakened by months of poor nutrition and harsh living conditions. Planting, cultivating and harvesting require intense physical effort during compressed time periods, and families must ensure that members retain enough strength and health to perform this crucial work. The nutritional status of family members during winter directly affects their ability to perform agricultural labour during the growing season. Adults weakened by months of inadequate food cannot work effectively in fields. Children stunted by malnutrition may never develop the physical capacity for farm labour, and elderly family members who lose too much weight and strength during winter may be unable to contribute to household agricultural production. Your family's agricultural productivity depends not just on land, seeds and tools, but on maintaining human resources through winter months when food is scarce and living conditions undermine health and strength. The calculations that govern winter food allocation must balance immediate survival against future agricultural labour requirements, another impossible equation that peasant families must solve correctly, or face consequences that compound across multiple years. The storage losses that occur during winter months represent another dimension of agricultural vulnerability that affects not just current survival, but future production capacity. Grain stored under peasant conditions loses nutritional value, becomes contaminated with mould and pests, and deteriorates in ways that make it less suitable for both consumption and planting. Seed grain that becomes infected with fungus may not germinate properly, reducing planting density and crop yields. Rice that absorbs moisture during storage may rot in the ground rather than sprouting, forcing families to replant with whatever seeds remain available. The quality of stored grain determines not just winter nutrition, but the foundation of next year's agricultural production. Your family's approach to minimizing storage losses involves techniques passed down through generations. Selecting storage containers that provide maximum protection, treating grain with natural preservatives, maintaining optimal storage conditions within the constraints of peasant housing, and constantly monitoring stored materials for signs of deterioration. But even the most sophisticated storage methods cannot completely prevent losses that reduce both current food supplies and future agricultural potential. The agricultural risks that your family faces compound during winter months when planning decisions for the next growing season must be made under conditions of extreme uncertainty about family survival, resource availability, and environmental conditions. Choosing which crops to plant requires predicting weather patterns, market conditions, and family circumstances that may be completely different by planting time. Conservative agricultural strategies that emphasize reliable crops and proven techniques may ensure adequate nutrition, but leave families vulnerable to exploitation by tax collectors and creditors who extract resources based on production levels. Innovative approaches that might increase yields also increase risks of failure that could prove catastrophic for families operating without reserves or safety nets. As you help your grandfather sort through the remaining seed grain, removing spoiled kernels and calculating planting requirements for the next growing season, you understand that agricultural survival in ancient China requires more than farming knowledge. It demands the ability to balance immediate survival needs against future production requirements under conditions where both present and future remain desperately uncertain. The agricultural desperation that defines peasant existence isn't just about inadequate resources or primitive technology. It's about operating within constraints that make rational planning almost impossible while facing consequences that allow no margin for error. Tonight, as your family measures out the handful of rice that will constitute your evening meal, you realize that the true miracle of Chinese peasant agriculture isn't the abundance it produces during good years, but the sophisticated decision-making it requires for families to survive the inevitable bad ones. The morning after discovering extensive fungal damage to your seed grain reserves, you're summoned to the village headman's compound by the bronze bell that calls all peasant families to collective obligations. As you walk through snow-covered paths between houses, you pass other villagers moving with the resigned shuffle of people who know they're about to face demands they cannot refuse and cannot afford to meet. Village headman Chen sits behind a low table covered with official documents, account books, and wooden tokens used to track labour obligations. His winter robes are silk rather than cotton, lined with fur rather than straw, and his brazier burns with steady warmth that comes from having adequate fuel supplies. The contrast between his comfort and your family's desperate conservation illustrates the social distances that separate even minor officials from the peasant families they govern. Spring corvée assignments and clan obligations, Chen announces without preamble, his breath visible but his voice steady with authority. The magistrate requires road repairs, flood damage reconstruction, and granary expansion. Additionally, several prominent families have requested assistance with their agricultural preparations, and the Confucian temple needs a renovation before the spring festivals. You feel your stomach clench as you realise what this means for your family's survival prospects. Corvée labour typically claims adult male labour for months during the agricultural season, but these winter assignments will take your father away precisely when his work is most needed for fuel gathering, food preparation, and maintenance tasks that keep households functioning during the coldest months. Your father steps forward to receive his assignment, and you watch Chen read from an official scroll. Zhao household, 60 days of road construction beginning at the new moon, plus 15 days of temple renovation during the spring festival period. 1 adult male, tools and provisions provided by assigned family. 60 days. 2 months of work when your family most needs every available person focused on survival activities. Your father will travel to work sites miles from home, carrying his own food and tools, sleeping in temporary shelters that provide minimal protection against winter weather. The family loses not only his labour, but also a significant portion of carefully hoarded food supplies to sustain him during state service. But challenging corvée assignments represents more than futility, it's dangerous. The social control systems that maintain imperial authority operate through networks of mutual surveillance and collective responsibility that make individual resistance virtually impossible. Chen maintains detailed records of every family's compliance with state obligations, and these records affect not just current assignments, but future assessments and treatment that extended family members receive from local authorities. The clan obligations that structure rural social organisation create another layer of complexity affecting your family's winter survival strategies. Your extended family network includes more than 40 households connected through blood and marriage relationships that generate mutual obligations extending across multiple villages and counties. These relationships provide crucial support during crisis periods, but they also create demands that can conflict with immediate family survival needs. Your uncle arrives that evening carrying news that illustrates both benefits and costs of clan membership. His village, located in a valley that receives different weather patterns than your area, has experienced winter challenges that create opportunities for mutual aid between family groups. But these opportunities come with obligations that extend far beyond simple resource trading. Your cousin Wei needs help with his corvée assignment, your uncle explains, as your family gathers around the small brazier that provides your only heat. His village was assigned stone-cutting work that requires skills none of his neighbours possess. If your father could provide technical assistance for 10 days, it would fulfil clan obligations and create mutual debts that could prove valuable during spring planting season. The negotiation that follows reveals the sophisticated calculus governing clan relationships during survival crises. Your uncle proposes exchanges involving grain, firewood, labour and social capital that could improve your family's winter prospects while strengthening clan bonds that might prove crucial during future challenges. But the arrangement requires your father to travel during harsh weather, expend energy on tasks that don't directly benefit your immediate household, and take risks that could result in injury or illness when your family can least afford such problems. Your parents discuss the proposal in whispers that acknowledge both its benefits and dangers. The assistance could provide access to resources and expertise that your family lacks, but losing your father's labour for additional days, combined with his corvée obligations, would place enormous stress on remaining family members during the most difficult part of winter. Your grandmother, the oldest family member and keeper of clan genealogy and obligations, provides perspective based on decades of experience managing extended family relationships during crisis periods. During the Great Famine 12 years ago, she reminds your parents, it was Wei's family that provided seed grain that allowed us to plant the following spring. Without that assistance, our household would have been reduced to begging or selling children to wealthy families. But she also acknowledges current risks. Wei's family survived that famine because they had connections to grain merchants through marriage relationships. Now those same merchant families are demanding repayment of old debts, and Wei's household is desperate enough to ask for assistance that could endanger our own survival if we're not careful about the terms. The debt relationships that bind peasant families into cycles of obligation represent another dimension of social control that becomes especially burdensome during winter months when resources are scarce and families lack income to service existing obligations. Your family owes grain to neighbours who provided assistance during last year's planting season, silver coins to the village money lender who advanced funds for tax payments, and labour obligations to relatives who helped repair your house after summer storm damage. These debts create vulnerabilities that creditors can exploit during winter months when families are least able to resist unfavourable terms or additional obligations. The village moneylender, who also serves as grain merchant and unofficial banker for peasant families, arrives monthly to collect payments and assess new lending opportunities with the calculating precision of someone who understands exactly how desperate circumstances affect negotiating positions. The Zhao family owes 3 dan of grain plus 20% interest from last spring's advance, he announces, reading from records that track every peasant family's financial obligations. Current payment can be made in grain, silver or labour services at rates I determine based on current market conditions and family circumstances. Your father knows that the market conditions the moneylender references bear little relationship to actual grain prices in distant markets and everything to do with local families' desperation levels. During winter months, when no alternatives exist, creditors can demand almost any terms they choose, knowing that families must either comply or face consequences that could destroy their agricultural capacity for years to come. The labour service option that creditors offer during winter months creates additional social chains that bind peasant families into relationships of dependency extending far beyond simple debt repayment. Working for creditors during winter means performing tasks that benefit wealthy households, while your own family struggles with survival necessities. But refusing such work can result in demands for immediate full payment that most families cannot possibly meet. Your family's approach to managing these debt relationships involves careful calculation of costs and benefits that extends beyond simple financial arithmetic. Maintaining good relationships with creditors provides access to resources during future emergencies, but becoming too dependent on credit creates vulnerabilities that can be exploited when circumstances change or when creditors decide to call in their loans. The marriage relationships that connect your family to other households throughout the region create both opportunities and obligations that affect winter survival strategies in complex ways. Your sister's marriage to a family in a neighbouring county provides potential access to resources and assistance, but it also creates expectations for reciprocal support that can drain your household's limited resources when her new family faces difficulties. The dowry obligations that accompany marriage arrangements represent major resource transfers that peasant families must plan for years in advance. But winter crises can disrupt these plans in ways that affect multiple families across extended kinship networks. Your sister's wedding, planned for next autumn, requires accumulating silk fabric, household goods, and cash payments that represent months of family production. But winter survival needs may force consumption of materials intended for dowry obligations. Your sister's potential mother-in-law arrives for negotiations that will determine not just marriage terms, but also resource-sharing arrangements that could affect both families' survival prospects. Her assessment of your household's current circumstances will influence dowry requirements, future support obligations, and the social standing that marriage will provide for your sister within her new community. The current year's difficulties are temporary, your mother explains carefully, using language that acknowledges problems without suggesting permanent poverty or inability to meet marriage obligations. Our family has always fulfilled its commitments, and next year's harvest should restore normal circumstances for all planned celebrations and obligations. But the visiting family's representative clearly understands that temporary difficulties during winter months can become permanent disasters if spring planting fails, or if imperial tax demands increase beyond what recovering families can sustain. Marriage negotiations become economic calculations that must account for uncertainties extending far beyond traditional considerations of social compatibility and family reputation. The village social hierarchies that determine access to resources and opportunities during normal times become especially rigid during winter months, when scarcity makes every advantage precious and every disadvantage potentially fatal. Families that own slightly more land, possess better tools, or maintain superior political connections can leverage these advantages to extract resources from more vulnerable households through arrangements that appear voluntary but operate under coercion of circumstance. The village's wealthier peasant families, those who own 5 or 6 acres rather than 2 or 3, who possess ox teams for ploughing, or who maintain workshops for textile production, use winter desperation to acquire additional land, tools, and labour services from families forced to sell assets for immediate survival. These transactions create permanent transfers of wealth that increase inequality and reduce the agricultural capacity of families least able to afford such losses. Your observation of these social dynamics reveals how winter hardship serves the interests of village elites, who can accumulate resources from families forced to sell assets, accept unfavourable labour agreements, or mortgage future production for current survival needs. The families that prosper during crisis periods are often those that exploit others' desperation rather than those that work hardest or manage resources most efficiently. The community mutual aid systems that provide crucial support during winter emergencies operate according to principles of reciprocity that create long-term obligations for families that receive assistance. The grain-sharing networks that prevent outright starvation, the fuel-gathering cooperatives that ensure adequate heating materials, and the childcare arrangements that allow adults to work outside the home all require contributions of labour, resources or services that families must provide even when their own circumstances are desperate. Your family's participation in these mutual aid networks requires careful balance between receiving needed assistance and contributing enough to maintain good standing within community support systems. Taking more than you contribute marks your household as parasitic and unreliable, leading to social isolation that can prove fatal during future crises. But contributing too much when your own resources are inadequate can leave your family without reserves needed for independent survival. The social pressure mechanisms that enforce community solidarity operate through gossip, social shunning, and collective decision-making processes that can exclude uncooperative families from vital support networks. Village women who gather at the communal well for water and information exchange serve as informal communication systems that monitor every family's compliance with social expectations and mutual aid obligations. Your mother's participation in these informal networks requires sophisticated understanding of how information flows through village social systems and how reputation affects access to resources and opportunities. The conversations that occur during daily water gathering, grain grinding, and textile work serve multiple functions: sharing practical information about survival techniques, coordinating mutual aid activities, and enforcing social norms that maintain community cooperation during crisis periods. But these same social networks that provide essential support can also become mechanisms for surveillance and control that make individual family survival dependent on community approval and conformity to collective expectations. Families that develop innovative survival techniques, accumulate unusual resources, or maintain independence from community obligations may find themselves subjected to increased scrutiny and social pressure that undermines their survival strategies. The religious and cultural obligations that bind peasant families into seasonal celebrations and ritual observances create additional resource demands during winter months, when families can least afford expenditures on non-essential activities. The winter solstice celebrations, New Year festivals, and ancestor veneration ceremonies require contributions of food, materials, and labour that compete with immediate survival necessities. Your family's approach to managing these cultural obligations involves careful negotiation between maintaining social standing within the community and preserving resources needed for family survival. Participating in religious celebrations demonstrates social reliability and ensures continued acceptance within community support networks, but the costs can be significant enough to affect family nutrition and heating for weeks afterward. As winter deepens and social pressures intensify, you begin to understand why Chinese peasant families developed such sophisticated strategies for managing information, hiding resources, and navigating community relationships that determine access to survival assistance. The social chains that bind families into networks of mutual obligation create both opportunities and vulnerabilities that require constant attention and careful management. Tonight, as your family discusses clan obligations, debt relationships, and community expectations that will shape your survival strategies for the remainder of winter, you realize that the harshest aspect of peasant existence isn't the cold, hunger, or physical hardship. It's the social system that makes individual family survival dependent on complex calculations involving dozens of other households whose own circumstances and motivations remain largely opaque and potentially hostile to your family's welfare. 4 months into winter, with grain stores dwindling to levels that would have meant certain death for previous generations, your family has been forced to develop survival techniques that extend far beyond traditional peasant knowledge. Your mother, now the household's primary strategist for resource management, gathers you and your siblings around the small table, where she's been experimenting with food preparation methods that your ancestors never imagined necessary. "Watch carefully and remember everything," she whispers, her voice barely audible to prevent neighbours from learning techniques that could mean the difference between survival and starvation. "Your great-grandmother taught me some of these methods during the terrible famine 15 years ago, but I've been developing improvements based on what I've learned from families that survived even worse conditions." In her hands, she holds a mixture that barely resembles food, but represents innovation born from desperation. Rice husks ground into powder, mixed with tree bark processed to remove bitter compounds, combined with dried grass that's been fermented to improve digestibility. It's survival bread that can provide calories and essential nutrients when conventional food sources are exhausted. but creating it requires knowledge and techniques that most peasant families never develop unless crisis forces experimentation or death. Your mother's innovations extend far beyond emergency food preparation. Over the past month, she's developed methods for extracting maximum heat from minimal fuel by creating enclosed burning systems that capture and redirect smoke, techniques for insulating your house using materials scavenged from abandoned buildings, and systems for collecting and purifying water that reduce energy needed for melting snow and ice. But perhaps most importantly, she's become connected to what you're beginning to recognize as an underground network of survival knowledge that operates parallel to official social structures. This network consists primarily of women, elderly family members, and others who are often overlooked by imperial administrators, but who possess practical expertise essential for family survival during extreme conditions. Widow Liu from the Eastern Village has agreed to teach you advanced textile techniques that can be traded for grain, your mother explains as she demonstrates preparation of the rice husk mixture. But she requires payment in information about preservation methods, and she insists that any knowledge shared must be passed on to other families facing similar difficulties. You realize that your mother is describing a shadow economy of information exchange that operates according to principles completely different from official tribute and taxation systems. Instead of extracting resources from peasant families to support imperial needs, this network creates value through mutual aid and shared innovation that strengthens rural communities' ability to survive governmental neglect and natural disasters. The techniques your mother has learned and developed represent adaptations that go far beyond simple resource conservation. She's discovered methods for creating medicines from plants that most people consider weeds, techniques for preserving food using fermentation processes that require no additional fuel, and systems for organizing household labor that maximize efficiency when family members are weakened by hunger and cold. But accessing this knowledge network requires more than curiosity. It demands carefully managed social relationships and the ability to contribute valuable information or techniques that other families need. Your mother's experiments with food preservation have created innovations that she can trade for access to knowledge about textile production, herbal medicine, and water management techniques that she couldn't develop independently. The key principle, she explains as you help grind rice husks into flour, is understanding that survival during extreme conditions requires skills that normal life never teaches. The families that survive multiple crisis years are those that learn to think beyond traditional methods and develop techniques that work when conventional approaches fail completely. Your education in underground survival techniques begins with learning to identify and process plants that can provide nutrition when cultivated crops are unavailable. Your mother leads you through frozen fields and forest areas, teaching you to recognize roots, bark, and dormant plants that contain calories and essential nutrients but require sophisticated processing to become digestible and safe for consumption. This root, she says, digging through snow to expose a gnarled tuber that looks completely unappetizing, contains enough starch to sustain a person for several days, but it's toxic unless processed correctly. Your great-grandmother learned the preparation technique during a drought year when conventional crops failed entirely. The processing method she demonstrates involves multiple stages of grinding, soaking, and cooking that remove toxic compounds while preserving nutritional value. It's labour-intensive work that requires fuel and time when both resources are precious. But it represents the difference between survival and starvation, when stored grain runs out before spring planting becomes possible. Your mother's knowledge extends to techniques for creating fuel sources from materials that other families discard or overlook. She's learned to process agricultural waste into burnable material that provides steady heat with minimal smoke, methods for collecting and drying animal dung that burns longer than wood, and techniques for creating charcoal from scrub vegetation that most people consider worthless. The fuel innovations your family has developed become especially crucial during the coldest part of winter, when conventional heating materials are exhausted and families must choose between freezing and burning materials needed for other survival purposes. Your mother's enclosed burning system produces twice as much heat from the same amount of fuel while creating charcoal that can be saved for emergency heating. during the most desperate periods, but the most sophisticated innovations in your family's survival arsenal involve techniques for managing social relationships in ways that provide access to resources without creating obligations that could become dangerous during future crisis periods. Your mother has developed complex understanding of how to participate in mutual aid networks while maintaining independence and avoiding the kinds of debts that result in exploitation when circumstances change. Never accept assistance that you cannot repay in kind, she instructs, as you observe her negotiating an exchange of preservation techniques for access to a neighbour's grain mill. And never provide help that creates dependencies rather than building capabilities. The goal is strengthening the entire network rather than creating hierarchies that benefit some families at the expense of others. These principles guide your family's participation in what amounts to a parallel economic system that operates beneath the notice of imperial administrators. This system involves complex exchanges of labour, knowledge, materials, and social capital that create value through cooperation rather than extraction, and that strengthen community resilience rather than supporting distant imperial needs. You participate in one such exchange when your mother arranges for you to learn advanced textile techniques from Widow Liu in exchange for teaching her family the food preservation methods your mother has developed. The arrangement requires travelling to Liu's village during harsh weather, but it provides access to skills that could generate income throughout winter and beyond. Widow Liu's workshop reveals innovations that represent decades of experimentation with textile production techniques that go far beyond conventional silk and cotton processing. She's developed methods for creating thread from plant fibres that most people consider waste, techniques for dyeing cloth using materials that require no purchase from distant merchants, and systems for producing textiles that provide superior insulation while using minimal raw materials. During normal years, Liu explains as she demonstrates advanced spinning techniques, peasant families produce textiles primarily for tribute obligations and trade with outside markets. But during crisis years, textile production becomes a survival skill that can mean the difference between freezing and staying warm, between having valuable goods to trade and having nothing to exchange for food. The knowledge Liu shares represents innovations developed through necessity during previous crisis periods, refined through experimentation, and preserved through informal networks of women who understand that survival skills must be maintained even when they're not immediately needed. Her techniques have been tested during multiple famines, floods, and harsh winters, representing accumulated expertise that official educational systems never acknowledge or preserve. Your education in textile production reveals the extent to which peasant survival depends on capabilities that extend far beyond agricultural knowledge. During winter months when farming is impossible, families that possess alternative sources of value production can continue generating resources needed for survival, trade, and preparation for the following year's planting season. But accessing these alternative economic opportunities requires initial investments of time and materials that families struggling with immediate survival needs often cannot afford. Learning advanced textile techniques requires practice periods, when mistakes waste precious materials, access to tools and equipment that must be purchased or borrowed, and knowledge networks that can take years to develop and maintain. Your mother's approach to this challenge involves careful planning that begins long before crisis periods arrive. During abundant years, she invests surplus resources in developing skills and relationships that become valuable during difficult periods. She acquires tools gradually when they are available at favourable prices, practices techniques when mistakes don't threaten family survival, and builds social networks through mutual assistance that creates obligations others will honour during emergency situations. The families that die during harsh winters, your mother observes as you practice spinning thread from plant fibres, are often those that focused entirely on immediate survival needs, without developing capabilities that work when normal approaches fail. Survival requires thinking beyond current circumstances to imagine challenges that haven't occurred yet but might occur in the future. This long-term perspective guides your family's approach to innovation and knowledge acquisition in ways that distinguish successful peasant households from those that remain trapped in cycles of vulnerability. Your mother treats each crisis as an opportunity to test and refine techniques that might prove essential during future emergencies, building capabilities that increase family resilience rather than simply addressing immediate needs. The underground networks that preserve and transmit survival knowledge operate according to principles that challenge fundamental assumptions about how societies organize economic relationships and distribute resources. Instead of hierarchical systems that concentrate wealth and power among elites, these networks create value through cooperation and mutual aid that strengthens everyone's survival prospects while maintaining independence and individual family autonomy. Your participation in these networks reveals how peasant communities have developed sophisticated methods for sharing crucial information while protecting families from exploitation by authorities or neighbours who might use survival knowledge to gain unfair advantages. The networks operate through personal relationships and reputation systems that ensure reliable information exchange while excluding people who might abuse shared knowledge. The tax evasion techniques that your family learns through these underground networks represent some of the most dangerous but necessary innovations for winter survival. Imperial tax collection operates according to assessments based on official records of family circumstances, but these records often bear little relationship to actual survival capacity during crisis periods. Your mother learns methods for concealing resources from tax collectors while maintaining the appearance of compliance with imperial obligations. These techniques involve sophisticated understanding of how tax assessment works, knowledge of legal loopholes that can be exploited without triggering official retaliation, and social strategies for managing relationships with village officials who monitor peasant family activities. The key, your mother explains as she shows you how to construct hidden storage areas that tax collectors won't detect, is understanding that officials expect peasant families to attempt evasion, so complete compliance actually attracts more suspicion than carefully managed partial compliance that acknowledges official authority while preserving family survival capacity. The techniques she teaches involve creating false bottoms in storage containers, hollow spaces behind walls, and concealed compartments under floors that can hide grain, tools, and valuables from official searches. But more importantly, she teaches you how to manage the performance of poverty that convinces officials that your family lacks resources worth confiscating while maintaining access to hidden reserves that ensure survival. These deception strategies require sophisticated understanding of how official authority operates and what kinds of behaviour trigger increased scrutiny versus acceptance. Your mother has learned to present your family as adequately compliant with state obligations, while concealing the innovations and resources that actually ensure survival, a performance that requires constant attention to details that could reveal your family's true circumstances. The mutual aid societies that operate within peasant communities represent another form of underground organisation that provides survival assistance while remaining invisible to official attention. These societies involve formal agreements between families to share resources during emergencies, provide labour during crisis periods, and maintain grain banks that can support members when individual family reserves are exhausted. Your family's participation in one such society requires contributing grain during abundant years to collective reserves that can be accessed during emergencies according to predetermined formulas that ensure fair distribution while maintaining incentives for individual family responsibility. The society operates its own storage facilities, maintains detailed records of contributions and withdrawals, and provides security for collective resources that individual families could never achieve alone. But the most valuable aspect of these mutual aid societies is how they preserve and transmit survival knowledge across multiple families and generations. The societies serve as informal schools where older members teach younger ones the techniques needed for crisis survival, where innovations developed by individual families can be tested and refined through collective experimentation, and where the accumulated wisdom of multiple households can be preserved for future emergencies. As winter reaches its most difficult phase and your family's survival innovations prove their effectiveness, you begin to understand that these techniques represent more than desperate adaptations to harsh conditions. They represent a form of resistance to governmental and natural systems that treat peasant families as expendable, creating capabilities that allow rural communities to survive and even thrive despite official neglect and systematic exploitation. The knowledge networks your mother has helped you access operate according to principles that offer alternatives to the hierarchical extraction systems that characterize imperial administration. Instead of concentrating resources among elites while impoverishing rural populations, these networks create value through cooperation and innovation that strengthens everyone's survival prospects while preserving individual family autonomy and dignity. Tonight, as your family shares a meal that combines conventional rice with the innovative preservation techniques your mother has mastered, you realize that you've received an education in survival skills that go far beyond what any individual family could develop alone. The harsh winters that threaten peasant survival have also catalyzed innovations that make rural communities more resilient, more self-reliant, and better able to resist the extraction systems that official authorities impose on powerless populations. Spring arrives 6 weeks late this year, and when the snow finally begins to melt, it reveals a landscape that bears little resemblance to the village that entered winter 5 months ago. Your community has lost 5 families entirely. The Chen household to starvation that claimed 3 generations in a single week. The Liu family to a house fire that spread when they burned furniture in a desperate attempt to generate heat. The Wang family to an illness that claimed the parents and left 4 orphaned children who didn't survive another month. The Zhou family to a decision to flee south that ended in their frozen bodies being found by spring travellers, and the Ma family to a murder-suicide that occurred when the head of household realised his family faced inevitable starvation. You stand in what was once the Chen family's courtyard, now empty except for collapsed roof beams and the circular depressions that mark where their grain storage jars once stood. Their deaths weren't sudden or dramatic. They were slow, methodical, and entirely predictable, the result of calculations that yielded incorrect answers about how much food a family needed to survive until spring planting became possible. The old grandfather died first, followed by the youngest children, then the mother, and finally the father who held on just long enough to see his entire family disappear before succumbing to the starvation he had postponed but could not prevent. Your own family survived, but survival came at costs that will affect every aspect of your lives for decades to come. Your father returned from corvée service 30 pounds lighter than when he left, his health permanently compromised by months of inadequate nutrition, and exposure to harsh working conditions that imperial projects continued regardless of weather or human consequences. Your youngest brother developed a persistent cough during the coldest part of winter that suggests lung damage from breathing smoke in poorly ventilated rooms where families burned anything combustible to prevent freezing to death. Your grandmother, who entered winter as the family's primary keeper of agricultural knowledge and social connections, now moves with the careful fragility of someone whose body has been pushed beyond its capacity for recovery. She lost more than weight during the winter months. She lost teeth, hair, and the robust health that allowed her to work effectively and maintain her role as family decision-maker and repository of traditional wisdom. But the physical costs of survival pale beside the psychological and social transformations that winter imposed on your family and community. You look around the village and see faces marked by experiences that no human being should have to endure. Parents who had to choose which children received adequate food, elderly family members who deliberately reduced their own consumption to improve younger people's survival prospects, and community leaders who made decisions about resource allocation that meant some families lived while others died. Your mother, who emerged as the family's primary strategist during the winter crisis, carries herself differently now, with the confidence of someone who discovered capabilities she never knew she possessed, but also with the burden of understanding how close your family came to joining the households that didn't survive. Her innovations in food preservation and resource management saved your family's lives, but they also revealed the razor-thin margins that separate survival from catastrophe in peasant existence. "We were fortunate," she says, as you help her assess what remains of the family's resources. "The techniques we learned, the relationships we built, the gambles we took, any one of them could have failed, and we would have ended up like the Chen family." Her voice carries an undertone of survivor's guilt that you recognize in other family members who understand that survival often depends more on luck than on skill, virtue, or hard work. The community discussions that occur as families begin planning for spring planting reveal how profoundly the winter experience has changed social relationships, and individual priorities. The mutual aid networks that developed during the crisis created bonds between households that transcend traditional clan and economic relationships, but they also generated resentments and suspicions that complicate efforts to return to normal social patterns. Widow Liu, whose textile expertise helped several families generate income during the winter months, now finds herself at the centre of debates about resource sharing and knowledge ownership that reflect broader tensions between individual family welfare and collective community survival. Some families argue that her techniques should be shared freely with anyone who needs them, while others insist that specialised knowledge represents valuable property that should be compensated when others use it. During the winter, we shared everything because everyone faced death, Liu explains during a village meeting called to address these tensions. But now that immediate survival is assured, people are remembering that knowledge and skills have value, and they want to be compensated for expertise that others are using to improve their circumstances. The conflict reveals fundamental questions about how communities should organise economic relationships and distribute resources that the winter crisis brought to the surface but didn't resolve. The emergency cooperation that enabled multiple families to survive created expectations about mutual aid and resource sharing that are difficult to maintain when immediate survival is no longer threatened by imminent starvation or freezing. Your father's experience during corvée service provides another perspective on how winter hardship affects peasant communities across broader geographical areas. He returns with stories about government projects that continued despite weather conditions that killed numerous workers, forced labour that resulted in deaths from exposure and malnutrition, and official policies that treated peasant welfare as completely subordinate to state infrastructure needs. The road construction we were assigned required moving stones through snow that was waist-deep. He tells your family during evening conversations where he processes his winter experiences. Workers who complained about conditions or requested additional food were beaten by supervisors who said that completing imperial projects took precedence over individual comfort or survival. His stories reveal how the corvée labour system operates as a form of systematic brutalisation designed to reinforce peasant subordination to state authority, while extracting maximum value from rural labour resources. The winter timing of many corvée assignments isn't accidental. It demonstrates state power by forcing peasant families to choose between family survival and political compliance during the most vulnerable periods of the annual cycle. But your father also learned techniques and developed relationships during his service that provide insights into how peasant communities across wide geographical areas have adapted to winter survival challenges. He worked alongside men from dozens of villages who shared knowledge about agricultural techniques, resource management strategies, and social organisation methods that represent accumulated wisdom about survival under extreme conditions. The families that survive multiple harsh winters, he explains, are those that think beyond immediate local resources and develop connections with communities that face different challenges and possess different capabilities. Survival requires understanding that your family's welfare depends not just on local conditions, but on regional networks that can provide assistance when local resources prove inadequate. This perspective influences your family's approach to post-winter planning in ways that represent significant departures from traditional peasant agricultural strategies. Instead of focusing exclusively on rebuilding local resources and capabilities, your parents begin developing relationships with families and communities in different geographical areas that might provide access to different types of knowledge, resources, and opportunities for mutual assistance. Your education in survival techniques continues as your family assesses what worked, what failed, and what improvements might be necessary for future crisis periods. Your mother's food preservation innovations proved effective, but they required labour investments and material resources that might not be available during different types of crises. The social networks your family developed provided crucial assistance, but they also created obligations that could become problematic if multiple families face simultaneous emergencies. The key lesson, your grandmother observes as she reviews the family's winter experiences, is that survival strategies that work during one type of crisis may fail completely when conditions change. The techniques that saved our lives this winter might not be appropriate for survival during drought years flood periods, or different types of social and political disruptions. Her analysis reflects sophisticated understanding of survival as an ongoing adaptation process rather than a fixed set of techniques that can be mastered once and then applied automatically during future challenges. Peasant families that survive multiple crisis periods are those that maintain flexibility, continue learning and experimenting, and avoid becoming overly dependent on any single approach to resource management or social organisation. The spring planting season begins with rituals and ceremonies that acknowledge both the families that survived winter and those that didn't. But these observances carry undertones of anxiety about future challenges that reflect how thoroughly the winter experience has affected community psychology. Everyone understands that survival through one harsh winter doesn't guarantee survival through the next one, and that the techniques and relationships that proved effective this year might not be adequate for future crises. Your family's seed grain supplies, carefully preserved through months of rationing and protection from pests and moisture, represent both success and vulnerability as planting season arrives. The seeds you plant this spring carry genetic heritage of crop varieties that proved resistant to local conditions, but they also represent nearly all of your family's agricultural capital. If planting fails, your household will face next winter with no resources and no backup plans. The agricultural work that begins with spring planting carries emotional weight that reflects how winter survival experiences have changed your family's relationship with farming and food production. Every kernel of grain planted represents potential survival through future winters, but also investment of current resources that could be consumed immediately to improve family nutrition and health after months of inadequate food consumption. Your mother's approach to spring planning incorporates lessons learned during winter survival in ways that represent significant innovations in peasant agricultural strategy. Instead of focusing exclusively on maximizing current year production, she develops plans that balance immediate productivity with long-term resilience, including diversification of crops, development of alternative income sources, and creation of resource reserves that could support the family through different types of future crises. This winter taught us that survival requires thinking beyond normal agricultural cycles, she explains, as your family makes decisions about crop selection and resource allocation. The families that died were those that planned for average conditions rather than preparing for extreme circumstances that occur less frequently but create much more serious challenges when they do arrive. The psychological transformation that winter imposed on your family becomes apparent as you observe how differently family members approach risk assessment, resource allocation, and social relationships. The experience of facing potential death created heightened awareness of how quickly security can disappear and how thin the margins are that separate survival from catastrophe in peasant existence. Your younger siblings, who were children when winter began, now display behavioural changes that reflect traumatic stress from months of hunger, cold, and constant anxiety about family survival. They hoard food compulsively, become anxious when separated from family members, and show signs of developmental delays that suggest malnutrition during crucial growth periods affected their physical and cognitive development. The family dynamics that governed your household before winter have been permanently altered by the crisis experience. Traditional authority relationships based on age and gender were modified by survival necessities that required family members to assume responsibilities regardless of conventional social roles. Your mother's emergence as primary survival strategist changed power relationships within the household in ways that continue influencing family decision-making processes. Your own education in survival techniques and social navigation has prepared you for adult responsibilities at an age when previous generations might still have been considered children. The knowledge you acquired about resource management, social networks, and crisis survival represents practical education that most people never receive, but that has become essential for peasant families facing an increasingly unpredictable and dangerous world. The village social structure that emerges from winter devastation reflects how crisis experiences reshape community organisation and individual relationships. The families that survived developed bonds based on shared struggle and mutual assistance that transcend traditional clan and economic hierarchies. But these new relationships coexist with resentments and suspicions created by survival decisions that benefited some households at the expense of others. The economic relationships that govern post-winter village life incorporate innovations developed during the crisis that challenge traditional assumptions about property ownership, resource distribution, and individual versus collective welfare. The mutual aid networks that proved essential for survival continue operating during recovery periods, creating alternative economic systems that compete with conventional market relationships and imperial taxation demands. The children who survived winter carry physical and psychological scars that will affect their entire lives and the lives of their own children. Stunted growth from malnutrition, learning disabilities from developmental stress, and behavioural problems from traumatic experiences represent human costs that extend far beyond the immediate winter crisis and will influence community capabilities for generations. The summer arrives, and your family's crops begin growing in fields that show damage from winter weather, but also promise adequate harvests. You understand that you've received an education in human endurance that extends far beyond agricultural knowledge or traditional peasant skills. You've learned that survival requires not just physical resilience, but sophisticated understanding of social relationships, resource management, and long-term planning under conditions of extreme uncertainty. The price of endurance isn't just the physical and material costs of surviving harsh conditions. It's the psychological and social transformation that occurs when human beings are pushed to the limits of what survival requires. Your family emerge from winter with capabilities and knowledge that will serve you well during future challenges, but also with understanding of how quickly security can disappear and how thin the margins are that separate survival from catastrophe in peasant existence. The harsh winters of ancient China created a population that was incredibly resilient, resourceful, and disciplined, but they also created conditions where survival often required moral compromises that would be unthinkable in gentler climates. The human cost of endurance includes not just those who died, but those who survived by making choices that challenged fundamental assumptions about human dignity, family loyalty, and community responsibility. Tonight, as your family gathers around a meal that includes fresh vegetables from your garden and adequate portions of rice that no longer require careful rationing, you feel gratitude for survival, but also awareness that the harsh winters continue shaping your community's approach to agriculture, social organisation, and long-term planning, in ways that will influence every aspect of peasant life for centuries to come. The legacy of winter survival extends beyond individual families to encompass changes in Chinese civilization itself, the development of agricultural techniques that maximize productivity on minimal land, social organizations that balance individual welfare with collective survival, and cultural values that emphasize endurance, cooperation, and long-term thinking over immediate gratification and individual accumulation. The peasant families who survived ancient China's harshest winters didn't just endure extreme conditions. They developed innovations in agriculture, social organization, and survival strategy that became foundations for one of the world's most enduring civilizations. Their legacy isn't just biological survival, but the creation of cultural and technological adaptations that enabled Chinese society to support larger populations, survive repeated crises, and maintain continuity across thousands of years of political and environmental challenges. As you sit in your restored farmhouse 10 years after that devastating winter that claimed 5 families from your village, watching your own children learn the survival techniques that saved your family's life, you understand that the harsh winters of ancient China represented more than seasonal hardship. They were the forge in which Chinese civilization was shaped, tested, and refined across countless generations. The techniques your family developed, the social networks you built, the innovations born from desperation, all of these became part of a vast accumulation of survival knowledge that enabled Chinese peasant communities to endure conditions that would have destroyed societies lacking such sophisticated adaptations. The price was enormous in human suffering, but the result was a civilization capable of supporting hundreds of millions of people on land that could barely sustain much smaller populations without these hard-won innovations. Your children will face their own winters, their own tests of endurance and ingenuity. But they begin with advantages that your generation had to discover through trial and error, often at the cost of family members who didn't survive the learning process. The knowledge preserved through oral tradition, social networks, and practical education represents humanity's triumph over geographical and political forces that seemed designed to ensure peasant suffering and death. The harshest winters of ancient China created the resilient, innovative, and cooperative character that became synonymous with Chinese civilization itself. In learning to survive conditions that tested the limits of human endurance, peasant families discovered possibilities for social organization, agricultural productivity, and technological innovation that shaped one of history's most remarkable civilizations. Tonight, as snow begins to fall on your village once again, you feel neither the terror nor the desperation that once marked winter's arrival. Instead, you feel the quiet confidence of someone who understands that human beings, working together with patience and ingenuity, can survive and even thrive under conditions that seem designed to destroy them. The harsh winters taught Chinese peasants that survival requires more than individual strength. It demands community cooperation, technological innovation, and the kind of long-term thinking that builds civilizations capable of enduring across millennia. The peasants who faced ancient China's harshest winters didn't just survive. They created the foundations for human societies that could transform struggle into strength, hardship into wisdom, and individual suffering into collective resilience that would echo through history for thousands of years to come.